Hello and welcome to another installment of Know Your Enemy with your host Czar Peppers. I've been meaning to finish this video a while ago, but here it is finally. In this series we take an in-depth look at the various tanks in War Thunder, showing you important module locations that you can take out, information of armor and weak spots, and some history to give you some proper context as to where the individual tanks fit in throughout the war. Today, we're going to take a look at the Tier 2 German tanks and assault guns. I find a lot of people say that the early tier German tanks are overrated, and in some respects they probably are. They have pretty average armor, with a lot of flat surfaces and guns that are rather poor until you get to the high velocity 75mm gun. Many of them, like the Panzer IV stubby 75mm, weren't even suited for tank-on-tank combat. They were primarily for infantry support using high explosive rounds. So now I'll give you a few examples about what I'm talking about. Here we have the Panzer IV with the stubby 75mm. And here we have it coming against a T-34 at pretty close range. That was sort of a miss. Bounce. 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 I think you're getting the idea. Now we have the Panzer III with the 50mm anti-tank gun, and this was the tank that was actually designed for tank-on-tank combat. And here we have another T-34 at combat ranges. Oh, that was a miss. Bounce. And keep in mind that in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, many of the Panzer IIIs weren't the 50mm, they were actually the 37mm, which was even less effective than this. Alright, so let's take a look at the armor and the modules in the Panzer III variants in Tier 2. The first one, the J1. If we take a look at the armor, you can see what the issue is. Only 50mm of effective thickness and a lot of flat surfaces. That's why it makes it so easy for the tanks like the T-34 with the 76mm to penetrate it. Now, you can increase the effective thickness by angling your tank, and that's what you really have to do in one of these things, otherwise you're going to get taken out pretty quickly. But if you are trying to target this tank, there's really nowhere you can go wrong. You aim right here. I find hitting the center right here is a very effective way of taking out the entire crew in one shot. If you're looking at it from the side, you really want to go for this ammunition down here. The armor thickness is only 30mm here, so it's pretty easy to penetrate with any Tier 1, well, most Tier 1 and pretty much all Tier 2 tanks. What I like to do is associate where it is in the tank with other objects on the tank. For example, it is right above the 4th road wheel. So you can remember, right above the 4th road wheel, directly below the commander's hatch, and about slightly below the track. I find the more associations you make, like the road wheel, the commander's hatch, when you see those parts of the tank, your brain will sort of automatically click and know that you have to hit right here. On the other side, it's exactly the same. Above the 4th road wheel, directly below the commander's hatch, and just slightly below the top part of the tracks, right here. Now, for the Panzer III L, there are some improvements to the armor. You've got this 20mm plate in front of the existing 50mm armor, so you do need a bit more penetration, but there are weak spots. For example, you can hit right here where there's a pretty large section where the spaced armor is not there. and it's only 50 millimeters, so that's a great place to hit. If you're feeling lucky, you could also try and go for this little circle right here. There's also the possibility of hitting down here. The track is 15 millimeters, so it's not quite as thick as the space plating here, but you'll need about 60-ish millimeters of penetration. From the side of the tank, it's much the same as the J1, only 30 millimeters effective thickness on the hull and the turret. So if you catch one of these from the side, it's not very difficult to take out. If you want to make sure to hit something important, it's exactly the same as the J1. The ammunition is stored just above the fourth road wheel, below the commander's hatch, and slightly below the track and the second sort of guide wheel. And it's exactly the same on the other side. And now we have the Panzer IIIM, which does have some other sort of jerry-rigged armor upgrades. Yeah, the Germans were pretty fond of jerry-rigging these things to have a bit more armor. It's basically on the front the same as the L, where you have this 20mm space plate in front of the 50mm armor here, but you can target this fairly large space that's only 50 millimeters. Down here, it's much the same deal on the last tank. The new thing on the M is these spaced plates on the side, 5 millimeters, providing you a little bit more protection, but ultimately underneath the hull is only 30 millimeters and the turret is only 30 millimeters. As for modules that you can take out, it is again the same as the other Panzer IIIs. The ammunition stored above the fourth road wheel and directly below the commander's hatch and slightly below the upper track, which you can't see here, but you really just have to remember the fourth road wheel on the Panzer III. The Panzer III was Germany's primary tank for destroying other tanks. Early models were fitted with the 37mm anti-tank gun that proved to be effective against some tanks from the early to mid-1930s, but once they started coming up with against more modern tanks that the Allies were using, the 37mm was seriously lacking in penetration values. But despite this, the people in charge of the German ordnance were extremely reluctant to upgrade to the 50mm anti-tank gun. They even ignored a direct order from Hitler telling them to upgrade the Panzer III with the 50mm, meaning that during the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, they were still armed with the lacking 37mm. Eventually, Hitler found out about this, and this time his orders were followed, and we can only wonder what happened to those who ignored his initial order. The 50mm was certainly an improvement, but once they started to encounter tanks like the KV-1 and the T-34, the Panzer IIIs were again unable to reliably penetrate the new Soviet tanks. They did have heat ammunition for the 50mm that could penetrate the new Russian tanks, but Hitler refused to supply them with the new ammunition because he feared the technology would fall into the hands of the enemy. Due to the size of the Panzer III's turret, they were unable to mount the large 75mm high-velocity anti-tank gun on it, meaning that from that point onwards, the Panzer IV would take on the role of the tank-on-tank combat role. What? So now we have the Panzer IV F1. It's really important when you see a target that looks like this that you distinguish the Panzer IV from the Panzer III, because there are slight differences in the module layout inside the tank that are pretty important to know. Now this tank is the armor is much the same as the Panzer III, 50mm plate on the front, flat surface here as well, and 30mm on the side. Now as for modules, it's a little bit trickier than on the Panzer III. You have a number of small ammunition storage areas. One is above the 6th road wheel, the other is above the 5th and the 4th. So remember the 4th, 5th, and 6th road wheel directly above and slightly to the right. So probably you could associate it with these guide wheels. One is right behind this guide wheel. Another is just in between the two, just around the track area. And the last one is behind this guide wheel. So also remember the second and the third track guiding wheel. I forget what the technical term is for them. On the left side of the tank, the easiest one to remember is probably this ammunition storage area right here, in between the second and the third road wheel. Between the second and the third road wheel, just in the center above here. Right here is where you want to hit. For the F2 Panzer IV, its frontal armor is the same as all the others, 50mm, very easy to penetrate. 30mm on the side, very easy to penetrate with most vehicles. And this one, the layout is a bit easier to remember than on the Panzer F1. All you have to remember is the ammunition on the F2 is along this nice flat surface right here. So if you hit anything in this area, you're going to hit ammunition. That's on the left side of the tank. On the right side of the tank, it's a bit smaller of a target. Just right here in the center of the tank, right there. You also have this big one right above the second and the third road wheel on the right side. So if you're trying to hit this thing on the right, above the second and the third road wheel. Also on the other side, above the third road wheel. So on the left, you want to be aiming above the third road wheel. From the right, you want to be, well, basically aiming above the third road wheel. But you might want to aim a bit like in between the second and the third road wheel. From the front, it's really the same as the other tanks. If you get a good shot right in the center here, it's likely going to take out the entire crew. And that's the Panzer IV F2. Originally designed as an infantry support tank, it was not meant to go up against other tanks. Its purpose was to use its high explosive rounds to take out machine gun nests, infantry, and static anti-tank guns. But when they found that they needed to fit larger guns on their tanks to deal with the new Soviet designs, they couldn't fit one in the Panzer III's turret because it was too small. So that's when the Panzer IV F2 came into the picture with its highly effective 75mm high-velocity anti-tank gun, meaning it would now take on the role of the anti-tank role instead of the Panzer III. The Panzer IV would become the most exported tank of any of the German designs. They sold them to Spain, Romania, Finland, and more. After the war, Syria used Panzer IVs that they had received from France. They even saw combat in the Six-Day War between Israel and pretty much every other Middle Eastern country. So now let's take a look at the Stugs, the Stug's armor and modules. If you take a look at the armor, it's not very difficult to penetrate. Again, it's much like the Panzer III, 50mm on this and quite a few flat surfaces. On the side, only 30mm. So the important part is, where do you aim? From the front, it's pretty easy to remember. What you want to do on this is, on the left side, aim for this flat surface right here on the left. You can memorize that by being this surface on the left, right above this hook down here, and that's fairly easy to remember and fairly easy to penetrate, although you do have this little sort of piece of armor that bulges up a little bit. I'm not sure if that actually will affect the shot. From the right side of the assault gun, you want to be aiming above the second road wheel. You have a nice big target ammunition right there. So if you hit anywhere in this area, only 30mm armor thickness, you're going to hit that ammunition. On the other side of the tank, on the left side of the tank, you want to be aiming above the two last road wheels, the 5th and 6th road wheel, just below the track, around where the engine is. So on the right side above the 2nd road wheel, on the left side above the 5th and 6th road wheel. And just a little tip if you're actually using this assault gun is, if there are any buildings around, try and make it so you cover this section of the tank. That protects the important ammunition of the tank, and you can still have your gun able to fire from around the corner of the building. And that's the Stug. Now the G model is a bit more formidable as a target. The armor at this spot is 80mm thickness, and that is where the ammunition is on this tank as well. So you need to make sure you have the ability to penetrate that 80 millimeters of armor. And it's the same all along the front. However, the side is still 30 millimeters. You do have these space plates, but one shot will break one of those off, and then you have a direct shot at the weak side armor. And the ammunition layout is pretty much the same. On the right side, it's above the second road wheel in this area right here. It's sort of hard to aim at because you have that spaced armor in the way, but if you aim about a foot above the second road wheel, you will hit that ammunition. On the left side, it's right above the fifth road wheel again, but it's a much smaller target, so you want to be aiming just above that fifth road wheel to take this thing out. And that's the G model from 1942. Assault guns differ from tank destroyers because the assault gun is generally used a higher caliber, lower velocity gun with high explosive being their primary ammunition, at least in the beginning. Their intended role was, like the Panzer IV originally, infantry support rather than tank destroyer, with the stubby 75 for taking out certain defensive emplacements. Eventually they were fitted with the high velocity 75, as we see in the Tier 2 variants. For most of the war, Stugs were primarily under the control of the artillery branch of the German military, being used in support of infantry rather than as dedicated tank destroyers, although tank destroying was a large part of its infantry support role, as it soon became clear. Although General of the German Panzer Forces Heinz Gagarin certainly tried to change that by transferring control over to the panzer divisions, but his attempts failed for the time being. Towards the end of the war, when German tank losses began to exceed production, Stugs began to replace lost tanks in the panzer divisions. Although they excelled in the defensive role, they were no replacement for a tank when it came to the offensive role, where the Panzer IVs and Panzers were generally used. By this point, Stugs were being built on the Panzer IV chassis after the Stugs main manufacturer was bombed during an RAF bombing raid on Berlin. A month after the bombing, only 24 assault guns were produced, so to offset the losses, they mounted the Stugs III superstructure on the Panzer IV's chassis. So there we have it, the Tier 2 German tanks and assault guns. Hopefully you learned some important information and you can use it in your game in the future. I think next episode is going to be based on the Tier 1 or Tier 2 British tanks, because I like them. If you like this video, please like. If you didn't like it, then dislike. If you want to subscribe, and that would actually be pretty awesome. So, go do that right now, please. Anyways, until next time, good night.